We have two panelists today, both Vermont home performance contractors, Jared Moats and Jim Bradley, and they're going to share what they've learned trying to close these sales. And as I said earlier, we are also interested in getting comments and questions from anyone who might be out there. So we're going to get started today by asking each of our panelists to introduce themselves, maybe just a brief explanation of the focus of your organization, and just a general outline of your sales approach. We'll have time afterwards to get into details, but maybe just letting us know how you approach sales in general and what your overall process is. And I'm going to start with Jared. So Jared, can you go ahead and tell us a little bit about your organization and how you approach sales?
Yes, thank you, Dave. My name is Jared Moats. Our company is Structural Energy Corporation out of Middlebury, Vermont. I have been in business for about 5 years now, so there's a lot of folks out there that have been doing this a lot longer than me. I have been in construction for quite a while, though, and that still remains a big component of what we do. We have about 12 employees, about half of which are devoted to home performance specifically. We have 2 energy auditors who work full-time doing the energy audits, writing the reports, and all of that. And then we have a crew out in the field of 4 employees doing the retrofit work. You know, when we started, it was me doing energy audits and me and a couple people doing the work. So things have changed a lot for us, but I do feel good about sort of where we're at and what our approach is. Generally, right now maybe a different topic, but we've dropped the price of the audit dramatically because we realized that, you know, we need to get a certain number of audits done and to convert the volume of work that we need to do, which, you know, our goal is 75 to 85 retrofit projects a year. Right now, between the 2 auditors, we're doing maybe 4 or 5 audits a week. And typically, you know, one of the auditors will go out to the project and start the audit, and me as the company owner, I like to actually make a visit out during that audit, you know, for about half an hour. And I think, you know, that's working out quite well. It gives me a chance to, you know, see the project, you know, talk with the auditor about how we're going to approach the project, and then it allows me to assist with the, you know, the development of the proposal for the work, as well as getting, you know, some face time with the homeowner. You know, I think it lets them feel like they're being attended to. And so we then try and get the report done within a couple weeks of the audit date. And typically I will bring the report to the homeowner, schedule a meeting with them, and sit down and present it to them. So the first time they see that audit report is when we're sitting down at the table going through it. And I've really, that's something that we didn't do for a long time, and I think it has made a big improvement. And quite often, you know, you're making adjustments to that proposal from that point on, and, you know, revising things and yeah, so, you know, I think we're quite frankly, we're still learning. You know, I think we'd like to see our conversion rates go up, and we're always looking for ways to make that happen, as we all are. But, you know, I feel good about the direction we're going and about the process in general.
Okay, so we'll move on to Jim Bradley for a similar description of just general approach. Jim?
Yes, Jim Bradley with Caleb Contracting. I'm the owner here, and basically we've been in the the home performance field for just about 7 years now, and things certainly have changed for us as well. We're running about 6 employees now, and then myself, but I am the sole auditor. So usually on my audits, I like to bring another employee with me to have them better understand the scope and why we're looking for certain things, so that when they're actually doing the retrofit, they have the ability to understand where some of those problems were found and then why we need to fix those. I take a lot of time with the customer to better educate them. As I'm sure we've all been asked, the customer will say, well, do I need to be there when you're doing the audit? And I usually say yes, most definitely, because I want them to understand what's going on behind the scenes, what we're finding. So that's the first exposure they have to it. And then, they can take notes if they'd like, but then we'll follow up with the audit report and usually try to schedule a sit down with them as well to go over things once again, because I realize that a lot of the things we're selling them would be an intangible product to them. It's not something like we're building an addition for them, but we are changing fundamentally how their house is operating. And we take that time with them to hold their hand and bring them along in the process, so that when they make their decision to move forward with a portion or all of the scope of work that we recommend, that they have a better understanding as to why they're agreeing to this. And I also like to keep my employees involved, so that we're always educating the homeowner. I think that's the biggest component here, is why this work is important. And it's not just always about saving energy, money off their energy bills, but it's also protecting health and safety, and it's also looking at the structural component of the home. And we do spend a lot of time, especially with the follow-up. If you look at the cost of the audit compared to the time spent, as we all know, it's a lost leader for us, but it does get us in the door. We're doing a significant amount of audits now. Usually we're doing 2 to 3 a week during this time of year, but before it was more than double that, and it's just it's been good in that respect. But the conversion rate for us has been usually pretty high, and we also offer general construction component to the business as well, so that if they're looking to do remodeling work or roofing work or anything else during the same time, and while we're there, it just helps sell the whole entire package. Keeping the employees trained, keeping them as part of that. We're looking to migrate our employees into doing more of the audits and becoming trained with some of the programs that are out there in the future. But right now we're in a definite growth time, and it's trying to stay on top of everything so that we give the customer service that they're looking for. But that's basically the model that, from a sales standpoint, we're not doing a lot of marketing, but relying upon the Efficiency Vermont website, and also highly the word-of-mouth situation, going to other contractors who are in the field who don't do this type of work that we do from a thermal perspective or home performance perspective, and getting them on board so that they call us to do audits for them. But that seems to have been working quite well for us.
Great. So before we move on to questions, just a reminder for those on the call that there's no visuals for this presentation. So if you're not looking at a PowerPoint presentation, that's okay, because there isn't one. I'm going to get things rolling by asking Jared and Jim a couple of questions, but again, we're encouraging folks to call in if you have any questions or comments of your own. So one of the things that comes up is whether every client is an appropriate candidate for a full-blown audit at the first visit to the house, or in some cases whether the first visit to the house should be something briefer or something else. So we're wondering what you guys do at the telephone stage, and how you might pre-qualify your candidates, what kinds of questions you ask them, and whether you end up scheduling full audits for everyone or briefer visits for some of your clients. So Jim, could you go first on that one, what you handle over the phone as pre-qualification?
Sure. What we try to do is first and foremost find out why they're wanting an audit in the first place. Is it just about comfort issues, energy savings, or are there other presenting factors? Have they heard something as an advertisement? What was their motivation? That's the biggest thing, because then that kind of steers us around to asking the next battery of questions. We always like to find out what type of fuel sources they have in the house. Are there noted mold issues, health and safety issues that they're aware of? We sometimes look at how old the heating system is, what type of structure they have. And when we ask the type of structure, that usually is a good indicator as to, it qualifies us more, because I can tell them, like if they tell me they have a cape, I can tell them where a lot of the problems are, usually over the phone, just because of our experience, or an old farmhouse, and some of the things we're going to be looking for, so that they're already aware that, hey, we understand how your house should be performing, how it's probably performing, and just understand where we need to go from there with the audit approach. We also try to find out, it's rare that I have somebody want to do just a partial audit. I do get those calls, But I'll tell them, I say, listen, if you want me to just come out and do an infrared camera scan, which we get those calls, I said I usually do a before blower door infrared camera scan, get a baseline, and then we'll use the blower door to find out the after effects. And I said, by the time you do that, you're pretty much at the cost of a full-blown audit anyway, and why not go ahead and tap into the resources that are there for incentives if you qualify for through Efficiency Vermont, because the money's there for you to help you in this process. And so we try to do that right up front with them. It's rare, though, that I'll just come out and do an initial site visit, but sometimes I've had people do that. If they're hedging it all, I will make that offer to them. I said, if I'm going to be in the area anyway, why don't I come out there, meet with you a little bit. I'll usually bring the infrared camera with me, especially if it's a colder day or a more temperature extreme day, to where I can just point out some things right off the bat, and usually that leads into them scheduling an audit anyway. And that seems to work really well for us.
Okay, so it sounds like you'll occasionally do a brief walkthrough, but you do relatively few of them, and most times it's a full-blown audit.
Most of it's a full audit, because by the time I'm done with them on the phone conversation, I'm letting them know you're only a couple steps away from having the full thing done anyway, and the costs are there with a 10% airflow reduction to help offset the cost of the audit with the other incentives that are available now. And usually it's not too much of a nudge in the right direction to get them to go ahead and okay the full thing.
Okay. And Jared, how do you approach that, the phone conversation?
Yeah, the phone conversation for us, is generally, it starts out with us describing, what an audit is and what's involved and how, how the process works. We do, have an intake form where we'll, just talk to them about what kind of house they have, what their concerns are, and that sort of thing. Earlier this year, we did implement a free and did some marketing to offer free home energy walkthroughs. And that was really in response because we weren't getting enough calls for audits, and we thought that the audit fee was preventing us from getting into people's homes. And that was fairly successful, although closely following that, we started offering $100 full audits. Partly due to our involvement with NeighborWorks in Rutland, and that was just sort of the way the program was headed. And so because of that, the fact that somebody could get a full audit for $100, we sort of, we're not really doing many free energy walkthroughs. But we probably did a dozen or so of those free walkthroughs, and I think every single one of them turned into an audit. But it was a way for us to get in the door and get people, get a little FaceTime with them, get them comfortable with us and with the process. And at that time of doing the free audit, we're at their house, so we get a lot of, you get a lot of information just walking up to a house and walking through the door and spending a few minutes with the people. So it made the audit a little easier following that up. So.
Okay. Another thing that we'd like to get into is what your general approach is once you're in the house. So we've talked about, overall viewpoint. We've talked about the telephone conversation. But once you show up to do an audit, there's, everybody has their process that they go through in terms of the diagnostics of the house. So that's part of it. But of course, we all understand that one of the main goals of that audit is to develop a relationship with the client. So I'd like to take a few minutes, have each of you describe what a typical audit looks like for you in that regard. And I would say feel free to take some time to just, describe this in detail. We have enough time, and the audit is an important part of the whole thing. So just a general description of how you approach things, and in particular, what do you do to establish that relationship with the client? I'm just going to alternate back and forth, so we'll have Jared go first on this one. Jared?
Yeah, sure. Well, like you said, I think the FaceTime with the client and getting them comfortable with us is one of the most important things. So generally when we first get there, we will sit down with them at their kitchen table or wherever and just talk about, us, what we do, and that can go in a lot of directions. You can just make small talk at first and get them comfortable with you. You know, talk about your kids, talk about where you live, where you're from. You know, it's a small community. You probably know some of the same people. You know, just, you know, generally get comfortable, you know, sitting down and talking with the person. And then, you know, really, you know, and I think one of the most important things all the way through the process is really to listen to what the homeowner's concerns are. Because we all know, you know, we'll get these calls and we'll go in and people are thinking about replacement windows or thinking about, you know, a new heating system. And we as, you know, performance contractors know that's probably not where we're going to start. But we don't want to just, you know, totally shoot them down. We want to listen to it. And if, you know, if they want to talk about windows, well, we'll talk about windows. And we'll, you know, then talk about the more important stuff, whatever. But basically, you really, you know, want to, you know, one of the questions I ask is, well, why did you, you know, why are we here? Why did, you know, what are your concerns? Is it, you know, costs, comfort, building durability? Are you thinking about, you know, doing an addition, whatever? You know, we have to, you know, just get a sense of what their goals are, and not just short term either. I mean, we start talking about, well, what are your plans are for 5 years? You know, are you going to be thinking of expanding, downsizing, whatever? You know, it's really, you know, a time to just chat and get comfortable with them. And that's, you know, we all know that an audit takes a long time. You know, there's so much data that we need to collect. There, you know, we need to map the house. We need to gather a lot of information to do a good, accurate proposal. And that's part of the reason why I try to, you know, as the owner of the company and not the person doing the actual auditing, I can come out and you know, expand on that conversation while some of the testing is going on. The guys that are doing the test always do have a good sit-down chat time as well, but when, you know, when I show up, I can expand on that a little bit, and it seems to work pretty well that way. So.
Okay. I just had a follow-up question to what we were talking about before we leave you, Jared, about you had mentioned that all of the walkthroughs that you did turned into full audits, and that sounds good. Did you do anything in particular to make that happen?
You know, I think not really. I mean, I think it was, you know, it was kind of like once we started offering this free audit, people were like, well, okay, you know, I'm not sure I want to spend $400. I'm not sure who these people really are. I'm not really sure what's involved. And it really is just a, you know, an expansion of the typical phone call that you get where you explain what the process is. You get to, well, actually, I mean, when you're there, you get to give them a lot better information, to be quite honest, because quite frankly, those of us, you know, we've been doing this for long enough where we can walk into a house and, you know, get a sense of what needs to happen without spending 4 hours there doing, you know, all the testing that we do. And so one of the valuable things about that is to even be able to throw out, you know, ballpark estimates. You know, say, hey, you know, you live in this leaky old farmhouse with minimal insulation, and, you know, we could come in and we, you know, we'll probably do some work in your basement. We'll probably do some moisture mitigation in your basement. We'll probably do air sealing, insulation in your attic, and you're, you know, you could be looking at a 30% reduction on your, you know, heating costs, and, you know, and then you can even throw out averages about what projects typically cost. You know, say, hey, our average project costs $9,000, but, you know, and that gives you a sense and gives them a sense of what they're getting into, and I think that's important. You know, it's not very comfortable to sit down with a proposal with somebody who is expecting to spend $1,000 and your proposal's for $15,000. You know, so anyway, we can lead into it with you know, just managing expectations, I guess, is important. So.
Okay, so on to Jim about a description of your general process in once you're there for the audit and building that relationship with the customer.
Sure. One of the things we like to do when we first show up, of course, is the initial site review and just kind of look for anything that's standing out as a as a possible issue that we need to be aware of. So as we're continuing to collect our data, I'm also trying to always educate the homeowner as to what we're finding and why. Definitely endearing ourselves towards the customer is really important to me. As Jared said, whether there's commonality with kids or other things that we've run into before, or just certain types of things in the same town, organizations they might be a part of, get them talking as well so they're comfortable to tell us stories and give us more information about the home, and as much as they're willing to listen to us do the same. And that's been very, very important to establish that relationship, and also the credibility factor comes into play there as well. We do like to start off, as I'm doing a data entry collection up front with them at the kitchen table or somewhere else in the home. I like to have, my secondary guy setting things up so the blower door is already set up and ready to go. It's a big time saver for us, and it gives me that one-on-one conversation without breaking conversation to go ahead and set up a blower door and then kind of lose my train of thought. It keeps me focused on them and their concerns, and once again listening to what they have to say and why we're out there once again. With that, I've been using for the last year and a half a tablet form of data entry for the Hero, because I would find that I get talking with the customer so much, sometimes I'd forget to take little bits of information that later you got to call them back for, and it makes you kind of look like, hey, why'd you forget this? But it keeps me on task using the Hero in the tablet form, so I can fill out the data right then and there and collect all the data we need. One of the things we like to do as well is that's when we'll go ahead and test if it's a gas oven. We'll go ahead and check the appliance and just see if that's safe and explain to them the hazards of CO, leading us into, do they have working CO detectors, explain to them the hazards of CO and why that could be an issue, especially if they have an attached garage, I'll even go into the science sometimes of how it affects the blood, and why that's important that we look for these things. And then, once again, always trying to educate with them. We'll also try to bring up, if we see, they have an old farmhouse, we can tell them about our experience with other farmhouses, why it's important not to have a dirt floor basement and then tighten up the home, or if there is vermiculite or knob and tube wiring. With capes, I personally live in one, so I usually tell them this is a success we've had with capes, including my own, and why it's important to me. And I'll always explain to them if we go over a scope of work that, listen, I don't develop the scope of work lightly, because I want to make sure that you understand that I'm looking at this as if I was spending this money, would I want to be spending these dollars this way, and taking the personal approach with them. And that seems to go over really well. We also like to find out, is there a history to the home? I was in a house the other day that I didn't know that in North Cambridge there used to be a general store. Well, it's the house I was actually auditing, and let the homeowner talk about that, and it was just a neat experience, and it gives us a better understanding of what the retrofits have been over the years, what they have done to the home themselves. I also like to find out what type of insulation's there, or if there has been, rarely, any air sealing done, but I pre-qualify that after a hard lesson learned that I want to find out who did those renovations, because I've spoken poorly about a renovation before and found out it was the homeowner that I was talking to right there, and that didn't go over too well. So I've learned to find out who's done the work and then diplomatically suggest this is why this wasn't the best solution, what insulation types work and don't work, and why we like certain insulation types or air sealing measures over others, and bring them into the whole process at that point in time. And I'm always very candid with them as far as the approach as, do we just want to get in there and get a home performance job? Not usually, because if we find that they've got a combustion appliance that's in a health and safety issue, we'll do whatever we possibly can to steer them in the direction of getting a heating professional out there to correct the issue because of the hazards that could be presented if we even touch the home at all. And being willing to step back away from a scope of work, knowing that they have to do other things to make their health and safety preserved. And that goes a long way to giving us credibility, I believe, with the customer, because they usually, after they get the heating system replaced, give us a call back to come and do the home performance work. And so that works really well. We also look for mold issues. Anything, with the mold issues or any other type of health and safety issues that could be a problem for them, and find out, what's going on inside the house. And you've got a bunch of mold in your attic. Does anybody have respiratory issues? And almost without exception, we find out somebody does, and it's usually the person located closest to the room. I'm not trying to diagnose their problem, but at least this could be a contributing factor. And that, once again, is the impetus to cause them to want to do something more inside the house. And in bringing them along step by step in this process, we have just found that it's almost them making the decision by the time we're done explaining the scope of work after the audit with the follow-up review, is that they say, yeah, this is why I want to do this. Had a customer today, when we first went over the initial data that we took and went over the audit report, he said he wanted to parse the work down and only spend this much money. And he called me today and he said, you know what, let's go back to the original proposal and do the whole thing because it just makes sense. So that was his decision. He made it, and he knew I wasn't trying to sell him on anything. And that just seems to work because he was educated and realized this is just going to make more sense to make my house more sound. So we take a lot of time with that. The whole thing with the combustion appliance, that's really crucial to me to know how that's performing. And I have heating professionals that work with me to help give them the best pricing, the best type of system that will work. We had a situation in St. Albans a month ago where a customer, I started telling them, listen, your system's already backdrafting. It was natural gas. It was already backdrafting, though, before we did anything else, and their water heater was doing the same. Come to find out their chimney had a bird's nest in it, was blocked, and started describing some of the health and safety issues that they could be experiencing. Well, headaches, tiredness, fatigue, they've been experiencing nothing but that for the last year and a half. I said, well, this is why I can't tighten up your home right now, but you need the system replaced. They replaced it, and in the last 3 weeks since it's been replaced, they said, we've had no more health and safety issues whatsoever. He called me the other day and signed the contract for the entire home performance scope of work. So it's just giving that credibility to us as, we're in this scientific field, and for them to trust in that, and that we're not just trying to get in there and do some caulking and walk away, is what I have found to be the most effective way to push jobs along and allowing it to be the customer's decision in doing so, but yet that's going to be the thing that sells the next customer because they're going to tell their friends and family, this is who you need to go with and why. And that seems to work out really well with us. But after we do all that, usually when we test the combustion appliance, we usually don't have the customer there with us because it's not as exciting for them unless we start to find problems. If the system's backdrafting or something like that, I can show them this is what we found, this is why, or your piping is not done right, or your exhaust is not done right, and this is why we need to make those changes. And that's the initial review. Then we'll follow it up once again in the audit report and then go over around their kitchen table again with them. This is why we're telling you this needs to be done. And it's that multiple exposure to the same data for them that I think helps them in the process of making the informed decision and helping the project move forward.
Yeah,
I'm really
Jim,
struck with
to add to the credibility issue that we all face. I mean, it's amazing to us that the horrific contractor stories we hear when we go in and start asking them about projects they've done in the past. And I think it just sort of leads to people have a pretty cynical view of contractors in general. I mean, you hear stories about, oh, they never finished, they took my tools, they drank my beer, it's pretty amazing. So anything that we can do to establish credibility, show them we know what we're talking about, I don't know, I mean it really takes a lot to in specific, in particular because the kind of work that we're doing is not something that people necessarily understand. You don't watch it on This Old House necessarily or whatever. It's just not something that is sort of general knowledge about homes. So it does require an extra effort to gain that trust, I guess.
Yeah, and I think that's a theme we're hearing from both of you guys, that the time spent with the customer, especially during that audit, is well worth it. And I'm noting that in both of your cases, you have the owner of the business there for the audit, either doing it himself or visiting during a part of it. And I think that probably goes a long ways toward establishing that trust. And I was struck with Jim's conversation about the chimney. That sounded very familiar to me. There's an ex-contractor out in Minnesota named Jim Fitzgerald who I learned a lot from back in the dark ages of energy retrofits, and he had a similar experience where he went to a place where they knew that there was something wrong with the venting of the system, but two mechanical contractors had been through and they had not been able to figure out what the problem was. And he figured out the problem, and it was something that was very demonstrable to the homeowner. So as soon as he showed it to the homeowner immediately understood what the problem was, immediately understood that even though Jim was the insulation guy, he was the one who found the problem when the heating guys couldn't. And as Jim said, at that point, quote, the auction is over. In other words, the customer is no longer buying on the basis of price there. You've established yourself as the person they want to do business with, and that can go a long ways.
And Dave, if I may, one other thing that
Sure.
helps us with the process with the homeowner, because everyone does balk at the cost, because some of these projects, we can tell them an average project ranges between $5,000 and $15,000, but then you get the old farmhouse that could be over $25,000. And that can be very daunting to so many people, as we know. But anything that I can do to help pre-qualify the homeowner's abilities and to help give them that sense of ownership that they're going to be able to do some of the work themselves, and explain to him that the caulking or the air sealing we want you to do is not just simple caulking, that we're going to take the time with you. My guys or myself will show you how to do it to get a good air seal, but make it look nice and neat so it doesn't look sloppy. And if you want to take that ownership part of it or anything else you'd like to do, the DIY part, and then we'll do the balance of that, that would be great. And of course, they like that, and some customers will turn. The wife will say to the husband, I don't trust you with a hammer in your hand. They're going to do it all. We might get that. Or we'll get the person saying, hey, I'm going to work hand in hand with you. I'll do 50% of the work. But I found that any part that we can bring them into the whole picture to do part of the work and get that sense of ownership, that also helps close the deal and get the sale moving forward.
Okay. I'm going to switch gears a little bit just for a moment. One of the things we wanted to bring up during this conversation is the $500 bonus incentive that we have going this summer. We're hoping that that's useful to you guys, and we're wondering how customers are approaching their marketing with that in mind and whether you're doing anything different. So I'm going to ask you two about that, but before I do, I'll just point out that two ideas that have surfaced here in the office is that one thing might be that this is a good mechanism for moving people along when they've received a proposal but they haven't acted on it, and going back to those folks with at least a phone call, if not a visit, and pointing out that this is a limited time offer and that if they go ahead with their project now, they'll get an additional $500 in incentives, and maybe that's a way to move somebody who's kind of on the fence. The other idea that's come up is the idea that not all these projects have to happen in a single phase, and that some people have trouble swallowing the whole thing at once. At Efficiency Vermont, we're certainly supportive of phased projects. We don't see a huge number of them, but we think they can certainly be appropriate in some cases, and we're wondering maybe we should be seeing more of them. So one of the things that we're thinking about is that if you combine the $250 standard incentive for the 10% air leakage savings with the $500, you're up to $750, and $750 will almost pay for a limited scope air sealing only project. So we're wondering if any contractors are thinking about trying to pitch that idea, that maybe you take advantage of the $500 incentive by doing a chunk of the most cost-effective work now, and then hopefully next year or the year after we visit phase 2. Are either of you doing anything in particular for the $500 temporary incentive? I'll let Jim go first.
We're trying to hold on and weather all the phone calls, because it has been a big motivator for the customers that we have without us making the call. It's more so the follow-up or the information and marketing that the Efficiency Vermont has put forth has gotten out there to people. And when I knew when the letters were sent, we got the email that said it was going to be sent, but we were getting phone call after phone call saying, can you get this done before August 31st? And with the bulk of the audits that we had, granted we've been hiring more people to do some of the work, but that might be a little bit challenging to get it all done before August 31st, to say the very least. But with that, a few customers that I knew that were on the fence that were doing their do-it-yourself projects, and they were going to do almost 80% of the work themselves, and they were kind of just trying to eke it out as they could. I had made the phone calls myself and said, listen, there is an extra $500 here for you if you can get it done by then, and that has been a big motivator from the do-it-yourself standpoint as well. But our customers, because they were made aware, I didn't have to make any calls. They were made aware by Efficiency Vermont, and they were calling us, and so I just told them that we will do whatever we can to make sure that they can capture those funds to help offset the cost of the project. So it's been working well from that standpoint, and I haven't had to make the extra calls unless it was already somebody who was a do-it-yourselfer, and just letting them know that they have a limited time frame.
Okay, how about you, Jared?
Yeah, I think, first of all, thank you for the $500 incentive.
You're welcome.
We actually, we are almost to the point where we're not going to be able to fit any more projects in before that deadline. And it really has helped us fill our schedule in a time when otherwise it would be challenging in the summer, because, people's tendency to, just push it off until they have to start thinking about colder weather. So, I think that, you know, at the time of when we're doing audits currently, we've sort of stopped promoting it on that front. I will say that when the letters went out, there was, you know, a great response, you know, for people to sign up. And it's great for us to be able to, hey, you know, send in your deposit, let's get you on the schedule, you know, so we can get it done. That's very helpful for us, and it's great for the homeowner. You know, and I will say another important piece, and I think Jim and I might be on the same page, is that we want to do a really good job presenting a good proposal to the people, listening to the homeowners, listening to their concerns, but we also don't want to be these, you know, pushy salesmen, you know, and so, yeah, when Efficiency Vermont does something like this, you know, and does a follow-up call, it's this outside, you know, party that is calling them, and it's not, you know, it's not us feeling like we're being pushy salesmen. And I think from the homeowner's perspective, they appreciate that call from you guys versus the call from us. So I think that's very important as well. And regarding the, you know, the smaller, you know, limited air sealing project to take advantage of a, you know, a much greater percentage of the cost of the project covered by incentives. And I think, you know, initially we, you know, almost cringe when we present a, you know, $10,000 comprehensive home energy retrofit, and, you know, a homeowner ends up wanting to do, you know, $1,500 or $2,000 worth of work, because you know, we tend to think of it as not as a profitable project. However, what we're learning is, you know, these one-day air sealing projects are actually very beneficial, and if we can, you know, we have a list going of folks who have these one-day air sealing projects, and it's actually really helpful to be able to fill out our schedules with those projects. And, you know, we may not be doing a, you know, getting them a 30% energy savings, but you know, we can make a big difference in a day when we go there with our blower doors and our trained technicians, and it seems to be working out for everybody.
Great. How hard do you guys try to get fuel use from your customers, either before the audit or at the audit? I mean, we all know that that's a fairly important thing, especially if you want to line up your savings estimates with actual consumption, that kind of reality check. But we also know that in Vermont, with a lot of people using unregulated fuels, irregular deliveries, they don't always fill up the tank, they're burning some wood, but they don't know how much, that can be challenging. So could you guys speak to how hard you try and how successful you've been at getting fuel records? Jared?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what we do generally, yes, we try. I mean, it's obviously very important. I mean, we want to give them a good, accurate, you know, savings estimate. But we'll explain why we need that ahead of time. We'll say, hey, you know, we're just trying to get a sense of your average fuel use. And oftentimes it's not, you know, it's not a spreadsheet of the past 5 years, but it's more like a conversation about, hey, you know, last year we did this, 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 and this winter was different, and we were gone for that, you know. So there's not a ton of structure around it. You know, obviously we'll tell people we want a 4-year average, but oftentimes they don't have that. So we'll just have that conversation and just try and get a good sense of what that is. Or, you know, but we also don't want to make them feel like they need to go dig around and find that information. And if it seems like it's something that they don't have a clue about, or they don't have good records of it, we'll offer to call their the fuel companies on their behalf and try and track that down ourselves, just to make it a little easier. But yeah, I mean, it is very important. So we do want to get that information. It's just, you know, sometimes it's a little challenging, but we do try and take it on ourselves if we have to.
Okay, how about you, Jim?
Well, we certainly try to qualify it and work really hard about getting that information. Not as much up front, though. we do ask them, what type of fuel sources they have, and that helps me understand what I need to tell them as far as what they're going to be needing to obtain. Like, do you guys have a wood-fired appliance? And of course, if it's during the winter months, please have it extinguished so before the day of the audit. But we ask them for accurate as possible cordage. A lot of times with the cordage, though, the problem is they don't really understand what a cord of wood is. They'll think they do by what the guy delivered, but you come to find out when you really get into it, they may not have that true understanding. So we do try to work hard on that, usually the day of the audit. And a lot of times what I'll do, if I know they're a Vermont gas customer or some other type of customer, I'll sit there right with them at the kitchen table and call their fuel company while we're there, because I have found with some providers, they think you're asking for the missile launch codes, and they will not give you that information, even though we've signed our confidentiality agreements and everything else. So to get away from that argument, I just go ahead and sit there with the customer. They can talk to the provider, give us authorization to get the data, and that seems to work out really well. Sometimes, though, when we get the data, we'll get questions back from Efficiency Vermont. Are you sure that these are correct? And we'll go back and verify it again, but because they may not think it's enough usage or whatever, and we'll go back to them and say, hey, do you have any other appliances out there that we might have missed or overlooked? So we try to work really hard with that, and that also gives a customer, in my opinion, better understanding of what they're actually using. I will have some customers who take the filthiest data and will have spreadsheets themselves, and I say that's good, that'll work out well. But other ones, I just tell them, if you call up before I get there and you ask for a snapshot of usage, your provider knows what that is. Try to get a 24-month at least pattern of usage, and we can use that as a baseline, and that seems to work out pretty effectively.
I like that idea about calling the fuel dealer right there when you're at the table with the homeowner, because it not only gets over that issue of the fuel dealer releasing the information, but it also makes that call happen as soon as possible, and it makes sure that it happens. Because if you leave it in the homeowner's hands and walk out the door, then of course you're never sure that it's going to happen at all. So before we move on, just a reminder to anybody out there, if you have questions or comments, or you want to input some of your own experiences, just hit that button with the hand on it and signifying you have a question, and we'll call on you. So both of you have said that when you go back to deliver the proposal, that you don't mail the proposal, that you deliver the proposal in person, and I certainly believe that that's important, and one of the recommendations that I've been giving people from the beginning. So could you talk a little bit about how that visit typically goes, and whether you have any tricks for softening the blow with the $8,000 proposal when they were thinking it was going to be $3,000, or what kind of reactions you get and how you work past objections? Jim, let's start with you.
Okay. Well, part of the proposal that we actually offer, and I know some people do a more truncated approach, some people do a more expansive approach, but we do a three-part system. We have the HERO report and estimate, which allows for costs and possible savings and incentives. We have a written proposal that describes the conditions of the audit, the day of the audit, plus each area of the home, the attic, the basement, living spaces, and each line item that we are recommending that they affect changes to increase efficiency, but also that gives us a chance, if there are health and safety issues, to identify those at the same point in time, or structural issues that we would recommend improving upon. And then we also have a written, or an infrared camera report that has the infrared picture and the actual real-time photograph of an area. And then we have a little bit of a dialogue there of what we're finding, because seeing things once, especially if we're taking 25 infrared pictures at a minimum, and they're not going to remember everything, but be able to leave that with them and understand that better, I think that gives the customer, it's a greater expense to us, but it gives that customer a better understanding of why they're spending the $300 to $400 on an audit up front, because there's value to it. And probably 50% of the proposals that or customers that we've done audits for will say this one comment: why didn't my home inspector tell me this? And it's just because there's certain qualifications. Once again, go back to the credibility, there's certain qualifications that they don't need to have to wear that hat, where with us, it's much more comprehensive, and then we'll sit down with them and go over the infrared camera, especially where there's been striking photos of the air leakage pathways or water issues or whatever. We'll show that to them once again and bring them back to the, oh yeah, that's what we saw the day of the audit, and then follow that up with, now to affect that change and why we need to air seal the attic, this is what it's going to cost. And we will also, if we need to, if I find it necessary, try to qualify why the work is so important, why it can be costly. point out the fact that as we're doing very, very skilled scientific work to make sure that their thermal performance of the house is increased, we're doing it in the most non-glamorous of environments, where you're trying to support yourself in between trusses or rafters and not fall through the ceiling while being in temperature extremes of 140 down to negative 30 and making sure you're still getting effective results. I said it's not a job for everybody, and there's a definite cost difference there. And so we qualify it with that. And then as we list a measure of importance as to why certain things should be done, we're also pointing out which ones will provide them the biggest immediate benefit. I do try to make the presentation as well as, like, you called me out here to develop a scope of work that will make your house as thermally efficient as it can be without sometimes a deeper energy retrofit or even trying to build a passive house. And we'll put those out there. And I said, but understand, if we take a link out of that chain that we built for you, the chain's not going to be as strong as it could have been. Because I'll tell the story that I've had customers take 3 links out of 10 out of there and expect the 10-link performance, and you're going to get, the same measures as before. And I said, once you start taking out certain measures, understand the benefit on the other side isn't going to be as great as we estimated or hoped for. But that's entirely up to you, and I revert back to being their decision. And that seems to, once again, have that chance for them to be educated, them to make the decision on their own, so that we're not doing power sales or making the statement, what is it going to take to get your business today? We don't do that. It's just more so that whole education component. And it seems to be a soft sell, but an informed one at the same time, and they just have a greater level of confidence about moving forward.
Okay. And Jared, how do you approach presenting the proposal?
Yeah, that's great, Jim. I'll just say I love the chain link reference. That's clever. So typically our report, we tend to combine. We basically go there with one written report, and it has all the, it starts out with the air sealing. It'll talk about, it'll have descriptions, and it's laid out in such a way that I'm going to, it hits my talking points. And it has, pictures of their home right in the report. So as we're talking through it, typically we're sitting there at the table. I have one copy of it in a nice little folder that, they get to then keep. But we're, 3 of us are sitting there looking through it, and I'm turning the pages and reading through it. And at the same time, I'm not reading it word for word, obviously. I'm hitting the main points of discussion. And with that, you can point out the pictures as you go down through. And at the bottom of each heading, there is the cost for that portion of the work and the savings associated with that portion of work. And through that conversation, like most performance contractors, we are coming at them with a very comprehensive proposal for a lot of work. Oftentimes that work involves, fairly expensive moisture mitigation or knob and tube replacement or whatever, so it can be pretty daunting. And through the conversation as we're flowing through the report, we don't have it listed in priority order, but we have a conversation about that. And I think that's very important to be, and you explain to them at that time that, this is the full report, and you explain to them why they're related and how they're related. But you also want to let them know that you're willing to work with them, and you can make certain adjustments to things based on their needs or their situation to get them the proposal that works for them, basically. I would say that it's very rare that we go present a work scope and proposal and it actually ends up being that exact same work project. We're usually making revisions of some sort, be it budget or some other reason. So that's generally how it goes.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a touchy question, and if you don't want to answer it, that's okay. But I'm really curious as to what your closing rate is. How many of your proposals get signed? Jared?
30 to 40%.
Okay, not bad. Jim?
Last year, before this year, last year I would say, so calendar year 2007 or 2011 and 2012 for that winter season, we were actually by 75% closure. I was pretty amazed by how many were going forward. But this year, it seems like we've been doing more audits with a lower rate. I would say we're probably between the 45 and 50% closure rate.
Okay, yeah, still pretty good.
So, it's okay. I mean, I wish it were better.
Well, everybody does.
I feel like, we're still learning. And quite frankly, there's plenty of people out there who are going to get value out of getting an audit, and maybe they have no real intention of having us do the work anyway, So there's a certain percentage of folks that fall into that category, for sure.
And I'm sure Jared's probably experienced this as well, is we'll get the call that we thought was a non-closure the year before, and then we'll get that call this next season saying, hey, we want to go ahead and go forward with the work, even without following up with them. And so that has been a surprise this year as well. Yeah,
we had actually quite a number of those last year, from the previous year, which is always nice, and it's encouraging because, if we can count on, several projects falling into place that from the previous year, that's a good thing.
And are you, most contractors make their proposals good for 90 days or something to kind of protect themselves from cost increases. Is that basically what you guys do?
Yeah, I mean, we do that, but, they rarely change a lot. We will re-look at it, and oftentimes, we'll in fact go back and look things over again just because it's been a year, But we don't find that the costs fluctuate too tremendously where it's a big deal usually. I mean, you hate to come back. You hate to come back to somebody and say, oh well, now that you waited a year, it's 20% more or something like that. It just seems awkward, unless it was justified. But I just haven't seen that justification.
So you're at the customer's house presenting the proposal. And inevitably, some of your clients are going to give you a response that goes something like, this all makes sense. We'd like to do it, but this is just too much money for us right now. How do you approach that? Jim?
I empathize with them as much as possible in the sense that, as a contractor, I just started an addition to my house that I wanted to do without extra financing because we had a new baby on the way, and that was 3.5 years ago, and the addition's not finished. So I use my own personal story in that regard. But I will say I totally understand that, yes, this may seem a lot now, but look at, and if it's something that I can foresee a payback, I will tell them, I said, listen, by doing this work, you are not purchasing a commodity. You are making an investment that will return in a better way than most any investment that you're going to make out there in the financial world. And I said, and once that money starts giving back, and I'll use a story like I had a project in Shelburne that they were spending $289 on fuel oil at the time. They invested $15,000 in improvements. The house was so terrible, it was 7,700 CFM. By the time we were done, it was just a little over 1,000. And I was able to show them that their return on investment was 4.5 years. I said, do you want that money slowly hemorrhaging out of your pockets to the fuel company, or do you want that to go into an investment to where after a certain amount of time it's going to go back into your pockets? And bring that back to them as well. And then if we need to, just go ahead and look at what are the things that you can readily achieve right now. And sometimes I found when they started in a little bit of the scope of work and start to notice some change, sometimes they will come back to us and say, can we expand this project a little bit back to where we were before? And so that seems to work. But if they just say, right now, I had a customer today that basically sent me an email finally responding to the audit that we had gone over with them and everything else, and said at this point in time they were looking at just the payback, and they said it could be a 20-year payback before it's done. It was an old farmhouse. And I said, yeah, it could be. And he said, well, at this point in time I'm going to just go a different direction and just try to look at this. And so we'll have those customers too. But the majority of the people that we deal with want to do at least part of the scope of work, especially when you can remind them of why this is so important, and you're going to be spending the money anyway. You just may be spending it in a way that will never be a return to you by sending it to your fuel provider or electric company. And that seems to be like, oh, yeah, you're right. So,
Jared?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that it's very common. We're talking about big projects. And I'd say our first approach is to talk to them about, phasing the project or scaling it back on some level. I mean, we might flat out say, okay, well, we could, if you want to let us know what a palatable amount of money would be, then maybe we can, pick and choose some of the low-hanging fruit and tackle that now. You got to kind of play it by ear. I mean, so that's one direction. The other direction is to really, like Jim was saying, talk to them about the investment, and also talk to them about some tools available to them to finance the project, because there are quite a few out there now that are pretty attractive. And so that may be an option for them. And you really want to just, try give them all the information, and then sometimes you just have to let it go and say, okay, well, when things are, when you feel like you can tackle it, give us a call. And those are generally the people that call you a year or two later and actually do the work.
How much difference do you think it would make if you had a financing package that you could offer them at that time? Is that something that you think would be useful? Would it just muddy the water? Would it not make a difference? Jared?
I think it's helpful. I think that, one thing we struggle with is that there's a lot of different options out there. I mean, quite frankly, most people can get a really attractive home equity type of loan at low interest rates. I mean, there's Vermont Green loans. NeighborWorks has some good options. And for us, it's hard to keep track of all that necessarily. So we tend to go to them and point them in direction if they feel like they need it. Oftentimes they'll feel more comfortable, talking to their own bank or whatever. But we just really want to make it be known that there are really good ways to finance these types of projects. And we've toyed around with the idea of being able to offer our own financing package, but that's just a whole area that we're not really ready to get into yet. But yeah, I mean, any good financing tool that you can steer them to, and it's, it just, there's so many out there that might be the muddy water that we're talking about.
Jim, any thoughts on that? Yeah, I think that having financial instruments at our disposal to offer is always important. Early on in the process, when I first got into the program, there were some of those incentives out there for low-interest loan, and then everything went crazy with our financial system, and so those low-interest loans weren't as attractive as some of the, just the home equity loans that they could get. So, definitely, though, having something available out there as an alternative to the customer, I think is great, especially when you can make the connection between the fact that they're making an investment now. Yes, they're paying for that up front, but the amount that they're going to save, especially if it's an oil customer, usually we see that this is a great opportunity, or a propane customer, is that they may be paying less of an interest rate to finance the project than the amount that they're actually now saving. And so connecting those dots for them, I think is a good thing as well. And, having something out there would be a benefit to them if we could, qualify the customer. I always try, as I learned in sales as a general contractor, is qualify who has the purse strings or the checkbook in the family, and who's making those financial decisions, whether it's one person or both. And I'll ask that question. I said, do you have a perspective on what this may cost? Do you have a budget you're working towards? And I'll ask that question up front, and sometimes I have to deflect. I said, I'm not trying to find out how high I can make your price, but more so I want to know where the realistic price range could be to make some of these changes and gear your estimate accordingly. So sometimes I'll have that dialogue with them, and it seems to work really well. with them, and then we'll say, okay, well, if you're looking at maybe only a $2,000 to $3,000 project right now, but yet you may be able to get something from a bank. There's a business up in St. Albans where it's a living apartment rental and also a business that originally we had a scope of work for her that was going to be close to $25,000 because it was an old farmhouse, no insulation, knob and tube, a lot of water issues in the basement. And she said, I've got about $10,000 to spend. What can we do? And then we went back out there, but her water problem, because of all this rain, has been exacerbated. And now she has mold throughout the building. I said, well, the scope of work has just changed. So she went from trying to pay for this out of pocket to then going to the bank for financing, and now the project has grown, but it's definitely going to be able to fix the issues within the building. So yes, having other financial instruments available to us, I think, would be a great benefit.
And that is something that, we look at over and over again. We've, in the history of our company in the 27, 28 years, we've looked at financing again and again and attempted. It's complicated, and of course a lot of homeowners have other avenues where they can get pretty low interest financing. Jim, you mentioned a comment from a customer about the undesirability of a 20-year payback, but I think that's a good example of the kind of perversion of the way that we look at economics of these projects, that we keep talking about payback when a 20-year payback is a 5% tax-free return on their investment, and most homeowners can borrow money at that rate or lower. Logically speaking, if you can borrow money at a lower rate than the return on investment of the project you're doing, it makes economic sense to do that, even ignoring fuel bills and comfort and everything else. But so it's kind of a perverse system. We have just a couple of questions. One person's wondering, have you seen any impact on your sales ability from the energy code? So as of a year and a half ago, these retrofit projects fall under the energy code, and that does put some new rules in effect. Perhaps the most obvious one is the R15 basement wall requirement. Have you found that that has been an impediment to selling things, the requirements of the energy code? Well, have Jim go first.
Okay, Jim.
Yeah, for ourselves, once again, that whole point of credibility again and educating, that has helped us because I have told people, say, listen, I know even if in a do-it-yourself situation, we have told them that you may want to insulate your basement walls. What I can offer you is this, and because what I have to do is this, and I'll walk them through the fact. I said, the teeth in this legislation is the fact that if I don't do my job right, even if you sign off on that and say this is all you want and you exonerate me from that, you can turn around the very next day and require me to bring it up to code, and any efficiency losses I'm accountable for. So I will bring them into that whole picture, and so that once again qualifies why my price is what it is. And I said, if anyone else is offering you anything different, then they're not doing their job appropriately. And then also with your do-it-yourselfers, I'll tell them, I said, listen, my understanding is even if you're going to upgrade these things and you've got a newly defined thermal boundary, you need to go ahead and make sure you're meeting those codes as well. But with that, once you bring them into the picture and explain that to them and understand, they have a better understanding. So I think that decision's easier for them to make, or at least to swallow and say, yeah, I see why I want an R15 there, not an R10. But they'll also explain the science behind the basement wall. I'll say, look at your basement wall. It's the single pane of glass, and you've got 8 inches of concrete for our value. So it makes much more sense to get that up there where you want it to be. And that I haven't had an issue with it, and it has allowed me to basically upsell to the code requirement without having any issues with that.
Great. Jared?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree in that, it is something for us to, it's a guideline for us, and something, when we bring up the fact that we're required to recommend, say R49 for an attic, but we're recommending R60, or we're required to recommend this, and it's because of these residential energy codes. Most people don't even know that there's an energy code out there. So it does lend to the credibility, and it is what it is. I mean, we're required to install this amount, and, it may, add to the cost of the project, but, guess what? They're there for a reason, and that's what we have to do. And out there in the competitive world of being a contractor, we are competing with people who have no idea there are codes in existence too, and so it does again lend to that credibility.
Okay. We had a couple comments that were typed in. One is a concern that if you offer the customer, a one-day or a brief air sealing project, that there's a chance that at the conclusion of that they will figure, well, I've taken action, I've done some of the most cost-effective stuff, maybe that's enough. Do you guys see any evidence of that it may actually be detrimental to offer them a way scaled down project because they'll only do that and they won't go for the rest? Jared?
No, because if we're not coming at them and presenting that small project. We're presenting a comprehensive project, and then based on either what their budget is, then we're scaling it back. So they know there's issues, and they know that we have to focus on we can't just do it's all tied together. We can't just do the air sealing while there's other issues, and so we're not presenting it that way originally. I think we're falling back to that, and we're accomplishing what we can, and then so no, I think it's a good thing.
How about you, Jim?
For ourselves, I go right back to the same thing of the emphasizing the ABCs of air sealing and just letting them know the most important part, usually, unless there's other contributing factors, is going to be your attic, and that's where you're going to get the best return by stopping that depressurization of the house and the re-infiltration of colder air. So I'll just explain, these are the fundamentals, and your middle area of your house is going to be more the neutral pressure plane. It's going to be less effective, but there still can be some good savings. So if they want to get the low-hanging fruit first, certainly that can be done, but then hit home again. But to get your greatest savings, these are the areas you're going to want to attack next. And so with that, if they're taking off just the small bite, it's usually not a problem for them to come back around later for the bigger. But usually for us, the smaller one day, I don't see that we're doing really much of that at all. If anything, they're wanting to hit home and get the attic first, and then the basement, and then look at the other. If they're going to put off anything, since I've tried to qualify them to do your own work sometimes, to do it yourself, they'll want to do that part on their own. So that's not something we offer normally as a separate item. We're more than willing to, but usually that's the one piece that they may be willing to do themselves, or at least hold off on for now, is what we have found.
Okay. We had another comment on another subject, just a detail thing, which I think is a good idea. The idea that when you're calling to schedule the audit, that you find out if they're burning oil, and if they are, you ask them when was the last time you had a clean and tune. The idea here being that if you get out there and the flue gas is really smoky, then you're not going to be able to complete your diagnostics on the heating system until after it's been serviced. So it would be better to have that service done before you go out. So that sounds to me like a good strategy. That's the bulk of the comments and questions that we've had come in. Maybe what I'll do right now is kind of summarize some of the key points we've made so far, and then I'll give each of you guys a few more minutes to kind of sum up and make any additional points that you want to make. So one thing that's come out of this conversation for me is that we've got two, what most people would call small, but in the home performance business, I would say medium-sized organizations, where the owner is heavily involved in the audit process and also in the presentation of the proposal. So both of you guys are having the business owner there as part of that process, and my sense is that that's partly to develop the work scope, but perhaps more importantly to establish that relationship with the client. I've also noticed that both of you are doing audits where for at least part of the time there are two of you there, which allows one person to do the kind of set up the blower door, do the test the homeowner isn't really interested in, while the other person can have kind of uninterrupted face time with the customer. That's seems like it could be fairly important. And also, you know, making sure that the customer is actually there for the audit so that you're not just giving them a proposal out of the blue and meeting them for the first time when you come back to present that. Both of you have been stressing the education part, that you're always educating the homeowner, that it's more of an education thing than it is a pressure sales thing. There's been mention that it's important to listen to the customer's concerns, what's important to them, what do they perceive their problems to be as opposed to what we may notice about the building itself, and also what their future plans are for the building, so kind of integrate that game plan with other things that they might be planning to do. Jim says he's been doing the Hero on site, which he sees as an advantage. It's kind of, I could see how it'd definitely be nice in terms of making sure that you filled in all the boxes before you leave and collected all the information that you need to. We got a little tip not to talk bad about the work that's been done on the house until you know who did it. That kind of struck home with me. I've made that mistake as well. I've also had a contractor in the house who slammed my work, which so I know how that feels from the other end. As far as general things, I think those are kind of the major things that have come out.
You said the education, manage expectations.
Yep, managing the expectations of the homeowner, trying to bring up the scope of work thing first. A lot of talk about establishing credibility, demonstrating your expertise.
Homeowner's goal.
Yeah, and again, listening to the homeowner to make sure that you know what's important to them and what related things that they might already have planned. Sounds like financing would be nice, and as I said, we're continually reevaluating that. Fortunately, we're still in a time and place where homeowners can borrow money at reasonable rates, at least those that have a decent credit rating and can actually get a loan. Yeah, and we talked about the two people at the audit, which makes a ton of sense to me, not just because it allows you, as we said, uninterrupted FaceTime with a customer, but also if you have one person there that's kind of at the top of their game technically, then the other person can learn from them and perhaps eventually take over some of that role.
Yeah, I also want to bring up that it was suggested to encourage DIY when that's appropriate as a customer engagement tool. So I'd like to add that as well. And we are reinvigorating that program because we do recognize the value of that for certain homeowners. Anything? I would like to make one last sort of call to any of the folks on the line who would like to suggest anything that they do that they have found that has worked very well. You can either raise your hand or actually call in. There's a I don't know where it is on there, so.
Oh, well, I thought you had one.
No.
I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to wrap up and say whatever you want. But before I do, I'm going to give you one question that's kind of pointed, and you can probably answer briefly if you have an answer at all. If you could change one thing about the home performance program to make it easier to sell jobs, what would that thing be? Jared?
That's a good one. Boy, I think, the incentive money is a big driver. I think, once we're in the door presenting information to people, there's only so much we can do. The one thing that's changed over the years is, the amount of rebate they get. And that's, as we see from this $500, that's a big driver. So, as far as things that we we're doing, I don't know. We're constantly trying to figure that out and get better at what we do. But I think the one thing that's, changed over the last few years is the program structure and the incentives, basically, what we have to offer them back, that's about all I can think of.
So I'm hearing more promotions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, whenever there's money, with that carrot out in front of them, and people think, people like to think that there's, they're getting a good deal or getting to take advantage of some, incentive to push them to do it. And I really like the $500, rollout, and on a limited time basis, it really pushes people forward. So anything like that is great. I mean, we keep talking about the financing stuff, and we understand there's a lot of good opportunities out there. I mean, I think, and Dave, I think you just mentioned it, that, there's good tools out there for people who can get it. And there are a fair number of people who, for one reason or another, can't get financing for it. And, if there was some way to reach those folks, that might be helpful. Some people just don't want to go to a bank to ask for money. I don't know what that other opportunity would be, but
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that is something that we're continually reevaluating. We're aware that one group that we really want to reach in more numbers, and we've had very limited success with, is those folks that make just enough money so that they're not eligible for the low-income weatherization program.
Right.
So if you're poor enough, you get the service for free. If you're fairly affluent, you can afford it. And our challenge right now is trying to make it easier for some of the people who are kind of caught in between. Jim, how about you? What would you change about the program to make things easier to sell?
Well, I think, going back to what Jared was hitting on, with the whole incentive thing, I was also thinking that, if the incentive maximum were only $1,500 right now, and that limited time $500 came out there again, I still think you probably would have had the same successful response in motivation, just because that was that extra carrot once again. And people do seem to be motivated either by the carrot helping them move along, or sometimes the punitive higher fuel prices causing people to move along because they're going to save more money. So there's that weird balancing act of trying to make it to not be a negative push forward, with the higher fuel prices, but that is a motivator, as we've seen. But the incentives certainly have been a help, and this is amazing to me how much this did push people along, even for the first-time people that we weren't even our customers. People are calling and saying, listen, I just heard about this, that there's $2,000 but another $500. Can we get motivated there? Or can we get on the books to help capture those funds? And that's a good thing. As far as what would help the overall home performance program, I still am of the mind, because of, when I go into an energy audit situation, I'm looking at the whole house as a structure and as a system, from a contractor standpoint to the energy assessment standpoint and everything else. And thus, I think that when you get that feedback from your customer, like I mentioned earlier, why didn't my home inspector tell me this? If there could be some kind of mechanism or push put in place, and I know this is a big thing because it would be a broad brush approach to try to get the legislature involved, but if there could be that thing to where it says, instead of a home inspection, or along with a home inspection, and it needs to be somebody who's qualified in home performance, certified in home performance, that can provide that true overall assessment, not just to try to sell a house, but to let that homeowner know this is what you're going to be getting into. I think it helps the prospective buyer, but it also would be an impetus to drive this industry, that if you're going to sell your home, you want an effective rating on your house. And if we could do something like that, or start that process, or push that process along, I think that would be a big thing in the home performance industry.
Yeah, well, two things about what you just said. One is we're happy that you guys like the limited offer aspect of the $500. That was definitely part of our strategy, the idea that if you put a deadline on, then that kind of pushes people to move. As far as the comment about the energy score, especially at time of sale, as you're probably aware, there are people trying to make that happen in Vermont, and the legislature has talked about it. It's, of course, a wider scope than Efficiency Vermont can do on its own. That's that's the state government of Vermont that would have to take action on that. But there is a push to make that happen. There's a lot of people that think it's important.
Yeah, and I want to say too that that there is some work here spearheaded by Efficiency Vermont on a home energy score and getting that at least going, whether or not it's mandated. And also part of the RFP that we're going to be putting out in a couple of weeks also calls for software that will be able to deliver a home energy score without a full, whole home comprehensive audit, but just with a walkthrough and using the software, you could give the homeowner a rough score, which certainly helps to add value of an efficient home, to that property.
Okay, so we have a few minutes left. I'm just going to invite you guys to take a couple minutes each and sum up and speak about anything that you want to in conclusion. Jim, you want to go first?
Sure. Basically, in conclusion for me is the biggest thing about this is, as Jared mentioned earlier and we've all heard about before, is the contractor that was in there last. Sometimes you just have a cantankerous customer, and every contractor is a bad contractor, but really there's been a lot of people here in the state that have been burned by people not doing the right work, and you're in their home and you're having to deliver that information that, listen, this isn't performing well, your house is being jeopardized here because the guy didn't know what he was doing, and you need to fix this, and this is why. And so I've also been in those audits where, on the other side of things, where in years past a home performance contractor had been in there and actually created some problems for the homeowner, and it really soured them on the whole issue of the program. Thankfully, they called again to have somebody else take a second look. But I guess the biggest thing I want to emphasize from my perspective is that we do everything possible to make sure our brand as home performance contractor actually excels that of just the regular construction industry, because we are those who are better informed. We should be able to exact better price because we have a better investment. We're bringing tens of thousands of dollars to the job site to affect changes to their home, and that our credibility is paramount, and that we need to do everything we can to help ourselves in that regard, but also other home performance contractors in the field, so that when word of mouth gets around, that is a positive marketing tool for us, because no matter how many radio ads Efficiency Vermont can do or ads I can put in the paper, it's that whole, we are a small town state. It is that word of mouth that gets out there, and if we have people that are working on our behalf, I think that's the biggest thing that we need to push. And we don't do any special marketing ourselves. We rely solely on word of mouth, previous customers that become repeat customers, and also the Efficiency Vermont website, and it pushes us along quite well. And I'm very thankful to have both those things in place. And so making sure that we maintain that and promote that as much as possible, and knowing that the work that we do has to do the same thing, and that we're always cognizant of that, I think is the biggest thing that I'd like to emphasize as a home performance contractor.
Okay. Jared?
Yeah, Jim, well said. And I think that I'd like to stress the point that we are, and all of us in Vermont, quite frankly, I mean, we all work in small towns, and it's really about building relationships with people and your clients, and it really starts at that phone call and at that audit and that follow-up meeting. And there's not, you can't always have the most structured approach to how you're going to sell a project, because every home is different, every client's different, their needs are different, they're, whatever. But it's really comes down to listening to what their concerns are and what their needs are. And I think we have to be respectful of what their goals are and what their thoughts are, and not just go in and I think us as building science folk and as the experts, there's a tendency to go in and just sort of drive home what we think needs to be done, but we really need to pay attention what their goals are and what they want, and that goes a long way. And certainly there's certain things that we have to do, but really the bottom line is to make them happy, and that usually is reducing their fuel use and making them more comfortable. But you want to leave them happy, and even if it's leaving them and not doing a project, if, you know, it's leaving the meeting and they're not going to do the project now, well, at least you've educated them and they have a good feeling about us as building performance contractors in general, and, you know, they'll maybe move forward down the line, or, you know, refer you to a friend. So there you have it. And I would also like to add that, you know, I'm very appreciative as a contractor to have you all, Efficiency Vermont, they are running this program and you know, hosting things like this so that we can all talk and figure out how to, you know, deliver a good product to folks. So thank you.